After years of dreaming, I finally bought a house with a lovely garden, imagining peaceful mornings and cozy nights in a home of my own. But barely had I signed the final papers when my husband James and his mother Grace took an unexpected interest in my new place. "We'll be moving in with you," they announced, each wearing an unsettling smile. Grace's expression turned sharp as she added, "And surely you won't oppose this. If you do, I'll see to it that my son divorces you." Her threat was clear, a reminder that if I resisted, she'd use every trick in the book, including my job, to turn my life upside down. I was dumbfounded, sensing the true scope of her intentions for the first time, and I knew that my dream home had just become the site of a dangerous game of control. Grace's plan was straightforward but ruthless. Force me into compliance through intimidation and subtle manipulation. I could feel my skin crawl at the realization that this wasn't just about living arrangements. It was about power. The forced move-in would inevitably include Grace's daughter, Mia, my sister-in-law, whose own questionable morals I had come to know too well. Imagining their constant presence turning my life into a twisted family dictatorship sent a chill down my spine. It was obvious that my refusal would only fuel Grace's anger, which would likely drive her to make James sign the divorce papers as she had promised. But that was just it. The thought of being freed from them all, even if through such cold means, was strangely appealing. What they didn't know was that I had no intention of surrendering quietly, but rather I'd let them fall into the trap they were so desperately trying to set for me. I had once thought that Grace was a kind, respectable woman, someone who would appreciate my efforts and the love I had for her son. But after we married, I saw her true colors. The first hint of her manipulative nature was subtle, a sudden demand that I handle all the household chores, from cleaning to weeding the garden. But soon, her demands escalated into a daily barrage of criticism. "You're not fast enough," she'd sneer. "Not good enough." James, who once promised to protect me, stood by in silence, apologizing only when he saw the toll it took on me. "My mother is strong-willed," he'd say dismissively, as if that was supposed to excuse her treatment. The more time passed, the clearer it became that my husband's loyalties were to his mother, not me, leaving me isolated and vulnerable to her wrath. Each day, I felt my sense of self erode, but somewhere inside, a fire of resistance was beginning to grow. Grace's demands and cold treatment weren't just limited to chores. They had a psychological edge that tore at me. She'd create situations where I was always at fault, where no matter how hard I tried, I could never meet her impossible standards. What started as small complaints turned into a storm of demands, cleaning every corner of the house, attending to her needs, and completing endless lists of tasks without a word of thanks or acknowledgement. I was working full-time, but to Grace, that didn't matter. Every effort was disregarded as she piled on more duties. The weight of her oppression pressed down on me, and I was slowly sinking under the burden. The loneliness was stifling, and even though I yearned for my husband's support, his indifference made it clear that he was never going to stand up to her on my behalf. As time wore on, Grace's behavior became increasingly controlling, and her plan to make me feel inadequate worked. I felt trapped in a web of manipulation that chipped away at my confidence, leaving me feeling powerless and isolated. I barely recognized myself anymore, constantly second-guessing each move, each decision, wondering if it would somehow set her off. My attempts to carve out any space of my own were met with sneering disapproval. She saw every inch of the house as hers, my presence tolerated only because I was married to James. Each day brought a new round of her disdain, and when I tried to speak up, her scornful remarks struck me down. Yet deep inside, I knew that if I could just endure a little longer, I'd find a way out, a way to regain my freedom from her suffocating control. Everything changed when Mia, my sister-in-law, moved back in. She'd recently divorced, and with nowhere else to go, she turned to her family, bringing her chaotic energy with her. Mia had a history of poor decisions, and this time was no different. She arrived with a smug attitude and little respect for boundaries, acting as if she'd done me a favor by joining the household. Her behavior was as unsettling as her mother's. Like Grace, she believed that I existed only to serve them. Whenever I brought up the unfairness of the situation, she'd shrug, her words dripping with disdain. "You don't have kids," she'd say, "so you wouldn't understand." It was a twisted sort of entitlement that Mia had, and soon enough, she was leaving her young child with me for hours on end, using her freedom to gamble and party with friends. She treated me like the live-in help, leaving me exhausted and furious. I reached my breaking point when I discovered that my husband James had betrayed me. A friend who worked in the same industry had seen him downtown with a much younger woman, laughing and walking hand in hand as if he had no other care in the world. When I confronted him, his response was dismissive. It's not what you think, he said. But his lack of remorse made it clear that he had no intention of changing. Grace's reaction was equally disturbing. She merely shrugged, suggesting that I was somehow at fault for James's behavior. According to her, a good wife would tolerate such indiscretions, chalking it up to a man's instincts. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of James's actions, but because of the way his family turned the blame onto me, making me feel like I was the one in the wrong. This was the final blow that hardened my resolve to escape this toxic family. Quietly, I began to plan my escape, knowing that I'd need every ounce of strength to pull it off. The house I'd recently bought became the perfect pawn in my plan, a refuge that could serve a double purpose if I played my cards right. Grace's obsession with the new house, her eagerness to take over yet another aspect of my life, would be her undoing. I intentionally left a real estate catalog with the listing in plain sight, knowing that Mia's curiosity would get the better of her. Sure enough, within days, they were both clamoring to see the property, eager to take what they assumed was rightfully theirs. They believed they were setting me up for a final fall, but they couldn't have been more wrong. In reality, I was ready to turn the tables and let them face the consequences of their own greed. On the day I signed the divorce papers, I felt a strange sense of triumph. Grace's smug face said it all. She thought she'd won, that I'd been cowed into submission. But I had my own plan in motion, one that required their cooperation, even if unknowingly. The property I'd purchased, while outwardly charming, had underlying issues that were well known in the area. Built on unstable ground due to old mining tunnels, the house would require costly maintenance that I had no intention of undertaking. I watched with satisfaction as they packed up their belongings and moved in, none the wiser to the problems lying beneath their prize. As I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I knew that my decision to step away from the mess they'd created was the only path to freedom. Not long after moving into the new house, the calls started. Grace was furious, demanding explanations about the house's structural issues, which were causing cracks to appear and doors to misalign. I listened to her complaints with a calm satisfaction, feigning ignorance as she spiraled into a rage. "This is all your fault," she shouted, but I merely reminded her that it was their choice to move in. The more she fumed, the stronger I felt, realizing that the tables had finally turned. For years, I had been subjected to their constant criticisms and demands, treated as nothing more than a servant. Now, they were the ones suffering in silence, forced to deal with the consequences of their own greed and entitlement. It was the justice I had longed for, and I savored every moment of their discomfort. In a final act of desperation, James reached out to me, pleading for a chance to make things right. But I had no sympathy left for him or his family. His betrayals, his mother's manipulative games, and Mia's self-centered behavior had taken their toll, and I had no intention of reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. "There's nothing left to fix," I told him, making it clear that our paths had diverged for good. He begged me to reconsider, to help him escape the toxic environment he'd chosen to uphold. But I had moved on, finally embracing the freedom I had fought so hard to claim. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, unburdened by their drama and demands. Months later, I learned through mutual friends that my former in-laws were struggling to keep up with the mounting repairs on the house. Their finances stretched thin as they tried to salvage the crumbling property. Grace's once formidable arrogance had crumbled along with the walls she now couldn't afford to fix. Mia's gambling debts had caught up with her, and James, stripped of his family's support, had resigned himself to a life of mediocrity. They had become trapped in the very cage they'd tried to build around me, each blaming the other for their misfortunes. Looking back, I felt no guilt, only a deep sense of closure. In their greed and cruelty, they had sown the seeds of their own misery, while I had finally found my path to freedom.